All right, guys, so we're going to cover lesson 3 here today. We're on page 47 in your book. So if you look at page 47, we have the picture of a ancient bird-like creature. It's actually kind of one of the first birds, but it kind of looks like a cross between a dinosaur and a bird. Okay, so this is about 100 million years old. This was lived about 100 million years ago. And over to the right, we have it's an X-ray of a crow. So it looks like a crow. I mean, that's what it is. But we can see that there are some similarities between these two that are pretty evident. I mean, they both had wings. You can see they both had wings. They probably both flew. I mean, the crow does fly, and this probably flew. So both organisms there, we can see they each have 2 legs, 2 wings, long toes. The fossil has fingers, but the crow does not. And so the fossil is kind of like a combination of a dinosaur and a bird. And it's actually believed that that's kind of like birds of today are the ancestors of dinosaurs. The dinosaurs were their ancestors, I should say. So that kind of reversed that. But crows today don't have fingers. Birds today don't have fingers. That'd be kind of maybe terrifying if birds today had fingers. I don't know. But based on the fossil of the organism's body structures, how do you think it moved? And well, we look at that and we think that basically these organisms flew. So these organisms flew to get around, maybe to catch prey, whatever the reason was, but they most likely were to fly. Okay. All right. So if we go here, so if you look at this group of elephants, okay, herd of elephants. So elephants stay together as a family. That's kind of so the elephants are one generation after the other. They just kind of stay together as a family. So would a baby elephant be more likely to look like its parent or look like one of its great-great-great-grandparents? And the answer is offspring, and not just by elephants, but this is all living things. They tend to look more like their parents. They tend to look more like their parents because their genes come from their parents. They are passed down from one to the next, and so they get passed down from one generation to the next. So the genetics, the genes that are passed down from parents to offspring they're going to have more in common with that than it would have more distantly down the line. So the traits that their great-great-great-grandparents, some of those traits they may still have, but some of them they're not going to. They're much more likely to have the traits from their immediate parents, and then their grandparents, and then their great-grandparents, and so on. Okay? So living organisms reproduce and pass on traits. Okay, and those traits can change over time. Those traits can change over time, and we call that evolution. That is called evolution, how those traits can change over time. An individual organism cannot evolve. Okay, basically that means you as an individual organism cannot change your genetics. You cannot change your genes. You cannot evolve. But over time, a whole population can. So very slowly, just a little bit of genetics get changed, a little bit of the genes get changed, and over time, the entire population can then change a great deal. And you can get actually new species start to originate, and we call that evolution. Okay, but if we trace that back, different species that live today may have once been one species, and we call that a common ancestor. Okay, and we talked about this when we talked about whales. Whales and hippos have a common ancestor. So there was one organism that lived, and then part of that species or part of that population of that organism went into the water permanently, and part stayed on land. So one part became today's hippos, and the other part became today's whales. Okay, and we can see that right over here. So we can see this is the organism, okay? Looks similar. This looks similar to a hippo kind of thing. I mean, it's kind of a cross between a hippo and a pig and all kinds of other things that it looks like there. Okay, but that organism is the common ancestor between all of the whales of today, and there's 2 different species of hippos that live today. And so this organism here is the common ancestor of both whales and hippos. Okay, So, if we look at this chart here, okay, so we see this organism. This is the common ancestor of all of these other organisms. Okay, so this one here, so one group actually became the hippos of today. The other group actually became these other ones. And most of these are extinct, and this is what we talk about when we talk the whales. So we had Pakicetus right here. We talked about Pakicetus. And then Pakicetus kind of slowly transitioned into today's whales and dolphins. Whales and dolphins. So genetic information, which genetic information is DNA. So genetic information in the form of DNA gets passed from generation to generation, and because of this, the offspring looks similar to their parents. Over time, genetic changes add up, and populations come to look more and more different from their ancestors. For whales, this explains why Pakicetus looks the most different from modern whales, and it looks most different because it is a very ancient relative of the whales. So what conclusions could we be made from the diagram of the whale evolution? Well, we can see that whale ancestors transitioned from land to water habitats. That's kind of what we can say, is that they used to be on land and they transitioned from land into more water habitats. Probably due to food resources most likely. Okay, so we can see that. We actually have examples of this today. Actually, if you go to, we've seen examples of this. If you go to Germany, there was a species of moth that lived in Germany, and it was a white moth because it blended in with the bark of the trees that lived in this particular area of Germany. The trees had white bark, and this moth would land on the white bark of these trees and would blend in, and organisms like birds couldn't get them and find them as easily. They'd camouflage. But during the Industrial Revolution, there was a lot of pollution in Europe and in Germany. And actually, there's so much pollution that the bark of those trees actually turned this kind of brown black color. There's so much pollution that actually stuck to those trees and actually turned the bark a different color. And if you have black bark on a tree and you have a white moth that lands on that black bark, it's not going to blend in too easily. But there was a mutation in that moth that actually there was just a couple of those moths had a mutation, and it actually changed. So instead of being white in color, it became this brownish black color. Well, if you look at that, now today, that moth is kind of that brownish black color. Still the same species of moth, but it actually changed because it needed to, and it evolved into actually a different color. And actually today, with less pollution, we're actually seeing it evolve back into that white color because the trees have actually transitioned back into the natural kind of whitish color bark, less pollution than what there used to be. All right, so we actually use things like 3D printing to model fossils. So the purpose of 3D printing is actually to get a realistic view of a model, because some fossils are very fragile. You can't pick them up. If you were to, they would just kind of disintegrate. If you've ever seen a fossil like of a dinosaur in a museum, that those are not the actual bones of the rock of those fossils. Those are actually molds of the original, because you cannot hook those together without them just disintegrating and crumbling. Okay, so a lot of times they use like a 3D model of this, like this ant here. So this ant is much larger than a normal ant would be, so it's easier to study the parts of that ant if you could just magnify it for a person. Or you might have something that is very fragile. Okay, so if we were to propose at least two ways that 3D printing could help students who are interested in studying fossils but cannot access actual fossils, well, we can make very precise copies, and the enlarged versions could be made so we can see them more easily. They're also more durable, so they could actually handle them and use them a little bit more and actually study these fossils. So there's evidence of evolutionary relationships. Okay, and what we do with this is we look for similarities, sometimes differences. We look for similarities and differences. And one of the similarities we look for is similarities in anatomy. Anatomy is the structures, what an organism looks like, the organism structures. Okay, those organism structures. So we look for those anatomy parts that are kind of related. And so if we look here at the next page and we look at different animals here. So we have a bat, the wing of a bat, we have the flipper of a dolphin, we have the leg of a horse and the leg of a cat. Okay? But if we look at the bones that are there, what do these four organisms have in common here? And the answer is they are all mammals. All of these are mammals. Okay? And so if we look at this, the bones are different sizes and shapes, but basically what it is here is we have the same bones and the same locations on each. So we have the same bones and the same locations on each. You kind of look at the color differences there, you can kind of see that we have the same bones and basically the same locations on each one of those organisms. They all form different structures, they're different sizes, different shapes, different purposes, but they actually have the same type of bones in the same locations. Okay. Another example of this would be a giraffe. A giraffe and the bones in the neck of a giraffe, we call those vertebrae. A giraffe has the same number of vertebrae in its neck as a human does. They're both mammals. But the shape of the giraffe's vertebrae are much different than a human's. So the shape of a giraffe's vertebrae are much longer and elongated. It actually makes it a lot harder for a giraffe to bend its neck, which is why if you've ever seen a picture or video of a giraffe trying to drink water, it's actually kind of a process for a giraffe to try to get down to water or something like that, because its neck does not bend quite as well anymore as a human's because the vertebrae have gotten so much larger. Okay, so these bones of these animals here have similar overall patterns of bones, which can indicate a close evolutionary relationship. They're all mammals. However, the limb bones are different sizes and shapes. And for example, the finger bones shown in the light blue and pink are different for each animal. The form of the bones can help identify the function of the limb. Yeah. So if we look at the bottom one here, it refers back to that picture of that old 100-million-year-old fossil of the bird and the crow. What anatomical, that just means anatomy, structures do they have in common? Well, both birds have long, thin bones in the wings and similar leg bones and skull structure. So they have some similarities. They also have some differences, but they have some similarities, and we can see this. Now, one of the examples that we look at for evolution and to see how closely related organisms are is we look for similarities in embryo development. Okay, so what that means in similarities in embryo development, it means as an organism is developing. So from when it first cells first get fertilized until they grow into a new organism. Okay, so we have early stages of embryo development. So we have one cell, and one cell starts to duplicate and we get more cells, and we get this what's called an 8-cell stage. Okay, and then they go and they get kind of like this ball structure. So this is like incomplete, but it actually would become like a whole ball with just cells around the outside. And then you start to get cells growing on the inside kind of thing. And then we get more and more layers on that embryo. Okay, so that's just kind of generally how organisms develop. That's actually how you as a human, actually when you start out as one cell, this is kind of the stage that you follow, actually. Okay, so why might so many different organisms develop different traits at later stages, but continue to have similar stages of early embryo development? And kind of the answer is the appearance of structures early, they could disrupt critical stages of growth later. So they all have to kind of start out similar. And if we trace that back, the more and more similar those the embryonic developments are, the closer related those organisms are to each other. So the more similar they are, the closer related those organisms are. So the longer they stay looking the same, the closer really they are evolutionary to each other. Okay, and so as an example, if we look at up here, we have a chicken, a cat, and a fish. Okay, and we look at the early stages of embryonic development, we see a chicken, a cat, and a fish. If you look at those three, if you look at an adult chicken, an adult fish, and an adult cat, they don't really look all that similar to each other, right? But if we look at their embryonic development, we can actually see that they actually look kind of similar to each other. And actually, if you look at it and you trace it back, probably the chicken and the cat look more similar to each other than they do probably to the fish, but they still have some similarities to the fish. If you look here, a cat and a chicken, they don't have gills, they breathe air. But in the early stages, they actually have gill slits, like a fish does. And so as a fish were to develop, the gill slits actually become gills. But in a chicken and a cat, they actually become part of the respiratory system. Lungs, esophagus, things like that. Trachea, actually, sorry, trachea. And so they actually become similar to what they need for breathing. And actually, humans actually look much like a cat does right here. So if you look at like the embryonic development of a human, it actually looks very similar to what this cat looks like. Okay, but as they continue to grow, they get different. They look more and more different until you get to when they are actually born, and they don't actually look all that similar to each other. But you can see that the chicken and the cat stay looking similar longer, and so they are more closely related than the fish is. Okay, so if we were to compare these structures, compare the structures of the cat and the chicken embryos shown in the photos above, which characteristics do the species share as embryos that they do not share when they are fully developed? And well, both animals have gill slits as embryos. Both animals have similar upper limb buds as embryos, and both animals have a long tail in early stages of the development. So what types of similarities would you expect to find in the embryo development of extinct and modern birds? Well, since they are closely related, the embryo development of birds would most likely be really similar to each other. So since they're related, closely related, the embryo development would probably look very similar. So the more closely related, the more closely that embryo development is going to be. Another thing we can look at is the symmetry of an organism's body. We can look at similarities and differences in body planes. Okay, so different groups of animals have different characteristics of body planes. Okay, so for example, most animals have what we call bilateral symmetry. So what does that mean? Bilateral symmetry. Well, bilateral symmetry means if we were to have like this a plane, so like a mirror or a piece of glass or whatever, and we were to divide an animal exactly in half, both sides would be in mirror images. So they're just like both sides are just opposite of each other. A human is that same way. If we take a human, you just look at both sides of a human, they are just exact copies of each other. Okay. You can also have radial symmetry, like a sea anemone, or unless you're Nemo, then it's a niminy. Okay, but you can divide it in many different ways, and it's still going to be exact copies. Humans, or most animals, it's just one bilateral symmetry. You can't divide it more than one way and have it be exact copies of each other. Both sides would be the same. So the body plane of a sea slug. So if you look at this sea slug right over here, see that sea slug? What is that? That is bilateral symmetry. If we were to divide this sea slug, so if we were to divide it right down here, right down the middle, both sides would be kind of mirror images of each other. They would be just opposite of each other. So organisms that have similar body symmetry are considered to be more closely related to each other than organisms with different body symmetry. Which organisms in the diagram do you think this sea slug is most closely related to? And since the sea slug has bilateral symmetry, it would be most closely related to another animal that also has this, in this case, the butterfly. So since the sea slug has bilateral symmetry, it would be most closely related to the butterfly. least related to the sponge over here that has no form of symmetry. You cannot divide that organism. A sponge is a real life organism. You cannot divide that in any way and have it be the same on both sides. All right, guys. So that's the end of exploration 1. We'll do exploration 2 here in the future.